Euphoria is a show that has commonly been described by its detractors as no plot, just vibes. And while I know most of you are here to watch me shit on season 2, I want to address both sides of the coin of that particular criticism because I think it will help us figure out how things sort of imploded the way they did. If you've never seen the series, created by Sam Levinson, starring Zendaya and distributed by HBO, what you need to know is this: the first season of Euphoria gained popularity because it didn't look or feel like anything else on TV at the time. It was beautifully shot, creatively presented, and you couldn't help but get drawn into its world despite the viscerally dark and uncomfortable subject matter, often portraying high school-aged children dealing with issues like substance abuse, sexuality, and domestic violence. If you have never heard anything about the show outside of that description, no plot, just vibes probably isn't what comes to mind immediately. However, season 1 puts style and flair over a typical narrative arc. Each episode begins with what is essentially a character study, narrated by our protagonist Rue. Outside of these little vignettes, which are objectively the best part of the series and also what most people remember about season 1, the show otherwise follows the life and times of several characters in present day who all intertwine loosely with each other. There is no clear-cut point A to point B. And that is when the show is at its best. I view season 1 as more of a masterclass in character study than anything else. And as far as characters go, there's a lot of good shit here, even if it's not the type of episodic storytelling that pushes a plot along the way we're all used to. Succession it is not, but it is something special, and it captivated a lot of people's attention for several reasons, just never the actual plot. So imagine my surprise when season 2 rolls around and Twitter is treating it like a big budget event and the episodes are introducing things like plot devices and foreshadowing, and it all seems like it's building to something. And then it just falls flat. No legs to stand on, tons of questions unanswered, and the show that was once a fascinating and creative little mystery on HBO has now entered Riverdale levels of self-parody. If what you're gathering from all this is that Euphoria fucked up by trying to actually add a plot, that's sort of what I'm saying, yes. But what I'm also saying is that the real selling point of the series, meaning its characters, is really where Sam Levinson went wrong here. To illustrate this, I'm going to break this video essay up into 3 chapters: the problem with Rue Jules, the problem with Kat, and the problem with Cassie. Buckle your seatbelts, chickadees, this is going to be a long one. Oh, and of course, spoiler warnings for season 1 and season 2. Like I mentioned earlier, Rue, played by Zendaya, is our protagonist, but the show really hinges on her relationship with Jules, portrayed by Hunter Schafer. In season 1, each character has their own demons to contend with. Rue is battling a severe drug addiction brought on by complications with grief due to her father's untimely death, and Jules, a trans girl, is navigating her experiences with sexuality, femininity, relationships, and gender. In season 1, Rue and Jules' relationship grows and evolves with the mutual understanding that they ultimately want each other, but they need different things. Nothing about their romance is perfect, and that's sort of what is the most charming about it. The end of season 1 culminates with Rue and Jules planning to run away together, but Rue bails out last minute, and the two are ultimately forced to reconcile their feelings about each other to different confidants in their lives, Jules to her therapist, and Rue to her sponsor Ali. And can I just say, those 2 bonus episodes in between season 1 and season 2 are the best in the whole show. So the way Sam Levinson proceeded to destroy any goodwill they had is absolutely fucking criminal. Anyway, the pair get back together in season 2, but their dynamic is interrupted by a third party, a new character named Elliot, played by Dominic Fike, who enables Rue's drug addiction and makes things complicated with Jules. Now here's the thing. I like Dominic Fike. I like his music, I think he's a fine actor. The fact that he's fucking Hunter Schafer IRL means that he's objectively won at life, so good for him. However, Elliot's addition sort of ruins Jules' character more so than Rue's. In those bonus episodes I mentioned earlier, Jules has a conversation with her therapist about her relationship with femininity, and how performing femininity became less about pleasing herself and more about pleasing men. Side note, Hunter Schafer wrote this entire episode, and it's so brilliant, so it's all the more painful to see the regression of Jules' character throughout season 2. Is it realistic of Jules' character to regress from this breakthrough and fall back into her own habits of performing femininity for the male gaze? Yeah, I guess so, but is it necessary? Think about it. In a show that hinges on the dynamic between 2 lesbian characters, is it really necessary? Especially compounded with the fact that this is one of 2 things that Jules actually does this season. She cheats on Rue, and then narcs on her for relapsing. Jules is one of the most interesting and refreshing characters in this show, and her defining moments in season 2 are not actually, her moments. She doesn't learn anything, and any growth and realization about herself and her relationships with others that she made in season 1 and in the bonus episodes have basically been retconned. She's barely in the last 2 episodes of season 2, and she is supposed to be the co-lead of the series. I've also heard the rumors that a lot of the weird writing choices were influenced by the fact that Hunter Schafer and Jacob Lordy couldn't stand each other, and we'll get into this later more with the treatment of Kat, but poor cast management does not mean you have to forgo an interesting plotline for one of your main characters altogether. As far as Rue, I think Zendaya absolutely kills it this whole season. Watching her spiral out of control is arguably the high point of the entire series, but if you really think about it, are there any real consequences for her actions? I don't want this whole essay to focus on plot inconsistencies because I'm really trying to stay character focused, but Rue steals a suitcase full of pills and now owes a drug dealer thousands of dollars, and the drug dealer quite literally threatens to sell her into sex trafficking, and then nothing happens. Nothing happens. Rue comes home from her long, bad day and ultimately gets the help that she needs with just a hint of foreshadowing that it might not be enough to save her in the end. Which, I don't necessarily have a huge issue with where we leave off because I think it's a unique way to tell a story about a character trying to outrun their addiction, but this is not a show that needs huge drug busts and shootouts or a sex slavery arc. It just isn't. And if you're going to add those elements to Rue's plotline because you want the stakes to be high, you have to at least follow through with them in a way that suggests you thought about it ahead even a little bit. Rue quite literally fucks around and never finds out, and that's a huge problem. Part 2. Okay, listen, I know most people don't give a shit about Kat, but please don't skip over this section because there is actually a lot to say here. Kat was one of my favorite characters in the first season. Maybe I'm biased here because I heavily relate to the whole journey from being body conscious to empowerment through reclaiming sexuality and how that can often lead to some very dangerous places, but it's also because Kat is one of the few characters that reminds the audience that this show actually does take place in high school. To me, her arc in season 1 is the most grounded that we have because high school kids are not as confident and consistent as this show portrays them to be a lot of the time. Kat learns to embrace herself and her power throughout the first season, and as a result makes some mistakes and gets involved in things that she shouldn't be involved in. Which is why I think her complicated relationship with Ethan does make sense in season 2. A boy her age is treating her right for one of the first times in her life, and this isn't enough for her because she's been trained to validate herself through the sexual objectification of older and often violent men. That is so interesting, and they could have done so much more with it, but instead, Kat is all but erased from the season, only having a few scenes with Ethan where she is unsure of their relationship and she breaks up with him in a way that is, very cringy. Now, we also know that this is because Barbie Ferreira, who plays Kat, is rumored to have clashed heavily with Sam Levinson over where her character was supposed to go. Supposedly, Levinson wanted to take Kat into more of an eating disorder-centric arc, which Barbie pushed back against because that is very regressive considering all we've seen of her so far. See the pattern here? Seeing Kat's art play out in season 1 was so refreshing for me because most of the time the only thing that writers seem to know how to do with plus-size characters is to give them scenes that involve throwing up in a toilet bowl and hating themselves. So while I'm glad we didn't have to see that in season 2, I am not pleased with the fact that one of the most intriguing characters was basically removed from the show entirely because of some off-screen beef. Sam Levinson clearly does not know how to manage a cast and we are all worse off for it, but especially Kat. Part 3, the fetishization of Cassie needs to fucking stop. I'll be honest here, Cassie was never my favorite character in season 1 or 2. I find her whole relationship with McKay to be kind of boring, and so I was not exactly thrilled to discover that she would become the main focal point as the show progressed. That isn't to say I don't like Sydney Sweeney. She's very talented and she's beautiful, and I would not object to her running me over with her car. But Cassie just isn't the one to be carrying this season. She just isn't. The fact that her arc this time around hinges on her romance and subsequent obsession with Nate Jacobs is predictable, and I wouldn't mind it that much if it weren't for 2 key issues. 1, now that the show has decided to be more plot than just vibes, their relationship is defined by the most absurd circumstances possible. And 2, every episode decides to address the fetishization of Cassie's innocence in some capacity, and it's really fucking weird. Let's break down that first part. After a chance encounter with Nate, Cassie decides that she has to change herself in order to please him because her worth as a person becomes reliant upon his validation both sexually and romantically. Does this make sense considering what we know about Cassie so far? Sure. But because this relationship comes at the expense of her friendship with Maddie, who has been on and off with Nate since the dawn of time, Cassie spends the whole season crying and whining about how no one understands her. I talked about this a little bit in my review for Sex Life, but that shit is so boring to me. Of course it's realistic for characters to feel guilt, but it's really not that interesting and can become extremely one-note very quickly. Of course, Cassie does reach the conclusion of fuck it, I don't care toward the very end of the season, but that heel turn does not come quickly enough for me to be invested in it. Especially because the most interesting things about Nate as a character were his relationship with Jules, his internalized homophobia, and his complex feelings about his father, none of which are fleshed out this season in the way that they absolutely should have been. So other than that, he is a plank of driftwood with sadomasochistic tendencies, and focusing the plot of a show around two women who are routinely hurt and manipulated by him is really not what we're all here for, especially considering that this show is supposed to be about Rue and Jules! So the logistics of this plotline are really boring until the end when they get really fucking cringe, but let's talk about the cerebral subtext of Euphoria. Euphoria is known for sort of blurring the lines between fantasy and reality in a way that's often creative and unique. Sometimes new information about a character or their current mental state is communicated in a flashback or a dream sequence, which I really like. I think it sets the show apart. However, when the show does this with Cassie in season 2, it's very clear that it's just Sam Levinson projecting his weird fetish shit onto her, and it totally takes you out of the whole thing because of how over the top he gets with it.
Any soon-to-be mamas want to take a dip?
This is so weird and unnecessary, and I'm usually not one for the Euphoria should take place in college argument because it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but no high schooler I've ever met is thinking about this shit, traumatic brain injury or not. And yeah, sure, you can argue that this was a one-off weird fantasy that Nate had because Fez rocked his shit, but then it happens again.
I don't deserve you, but I love you. Please, when I go to college, move with me, marry me, have my babies.
And then my final straw, which I won't show because I don't want to get flagged, but basically Cassie and Nate are fucking and she does a whole monologue while she's writing him about how she belongs to him and she's his submissive, and it's all very derivative and is probably based on the best sex that Sam Levinson has ever had that he still hasn't gotten over, so he decided to just verbate his fantasy into a script, but no high schooler talks like this! You're telling me that a 17-year-old is going to recite a fully fleshed out "I belong to you" monologue while they're fucking and she's putting her fingers in his mouth? Absolutely goddamn not, dude. From the research that I've done, Sydney Sweeney did say that she felt very safe on the set and that everything was performed the right way with intimacy coordinators and that she didn't feel coerced into anything, which is cool. But this weird fetish projecting nonsense comes at the expense of good storytelling and actual character development, which is really unfortunate considering that I think there could have been some real material for Cassie to work with here if Sam Levinson wasn't obsessed with revolving the plot around her constant humiliation or sexualization. Mark my words, this dude is probably into some sick shit, which is fine, whatever floats your boat, but watching it constantly creep into a show like this is really unsettling because it doesn't feel like it's happening to the character, it feels like it's happening to the actual person. Other rapid fire things I didn't like about this season: Ashtray's death was so stupid and it only happened the way it did because he needed to go to Umbrella Academy and they couldn't kill off Fez without a riot. The play could have been really interesting, but all of it was handled so poorly, and I really don't think Lexi is the saving grace of this show that everyone thinks she is. I actually really like the stuff with Cal, but I understand why everyone has complicated feelings about it. Ali is the most underrated character in this entire show, and they really did Dominic Fike dirty with that long-ass song at the end. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.